Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this final panel and what's been a wonderful weekend of dialogue. My name is Sara Zewde. I'm an assistant professor of practice in the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the GSD. Additionally, I'm also principal at Studio Zewde, a full-service landscape architecture firm based in New York City. I want to start by thanking Rafaela and Anita and all of the contributors on the stage, behind the stage, that have made this conference and these important conversations happen this weekend. And I'm so excited to be moderating this final panel, in part because of the interdisciplinarity that the panel is exemplary of and that the conference is striving to achieve. So I will start by encouraging you all in the audience to submit your questions as they come up in your mind throughout the presentations, because we do want to encourage as much dialogue with the larger audience as we can in this final panel. So I'll start by introducing our panelists today. We have Dr. Justin Dunnavant, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. His current research in the U.S. Virgin Islands investigates the relationship between ecology and enslavement in the former Danish West Indies. In addition to his archaeological research, Justin is co-founder and president of the Society of Black Archaeologists and an AAUS scientific scuba diver. In 2021, he was named a National Geographic Emerging Explorer and inducted into the Explorers Club as one of 50 people changing the world that you need to know about. He's also a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. His research has been featured on Netflix's Explained, Hulu's Your Attention Please, and in print in American Archaeology and Science magazine. His paper today is titled Toward a Black Historical Ecology of the Atlantic World. Dan Sayers is Associate Professor of Anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C. As a historical archaeologist, Sayers has analyzed and interpreted many archaeological sites across the U.S. through landscape perspectives that are informed by his political economic approach and orientation. He is the author of many academic articles, he has made numerous media appearances, and he has worked with several museums on archaeological exhibits. Sayers is the author of the book, A Desolate Place for a Defiant People, The Archaeology of Maroons, Indigenous Americans, and Enslaved Laborers in the Great Dismal Swamp, published in 2014 by the University Press of Florida. And he is completing a book manuscript, Historical Archaeology of the Homeless and the Home, also for the University Press of Florida. His paper today is titled Beneath the Surfaces of Historical Landscapes, Archaeology, African and Indigenous Diasporic Communities, and the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia and North Carolina. And finally, Dr. Diane Jones-Allen is Program Director and Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington. She is Principal Landscape Architect with Design Jones, LLC, which received the 2016 American Society of Landscape Architects Community Service Award. She participated on the 2017 ASLA Blue Ribbon Panel on Climate Change. She serves on the board of the Landscape Architecture Foundation as Vice President of Education for the 2021 year. Diane is author of Lost in the Transit Desert, Race, Transit Access, and Suburban Form, and co-editor of Design as Democracy, Techniques for Collective Creativity, published in 2017 by Island Press. Diane is part of one of two cross-disciplinary teams that won the 2020 SOM Foundation Research Prize, focused on examining social justice in urban contexts. She also received an appointment as fellow for Garden and Landscape Studies in Dumbarton Oaks for the 2021-2022 academic year. And her paper today is titled Living Freedom in the Maroon Landscape, An Ecological Way of Life. I'm so excited to hear from all of you, and with that, I will hand it to Justin.
Thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. And thank you all at the GSD for the invitation. I can say that I'm honored to be here. I'm sorry we cannot be in person, but I completely understand the circumstances. And hopefully one day we can get there. I need to apologize because I know I sent the moderators my slides last, because I've been thinking through and rewriting this paper multiple times until I finally gave up and said, let me just talk through all the issues that I'm going through and trying to frame this conversation in question. And hopefully in the Q&A, we can arrive at some generative points or conclusions and so forth. So without further ado, I will queue up the slides, or Matt will queue up the slides. Perfect. Thank you, Matt. And we can talk a little bit about this conversation about a Black historical ecology and what it looks like. This is a question that I've been pondering really for the last 5 years about what does a Black historical ecology look like? How do we frame it? How do we study it? And how do we actually deploy it and engage it in our research and our study? I am an archaeologist. I was trained in archaeology, terrestrial archaeology, and now maritime archaeological work. And ecology has been something that's been more front and center in the recent work I've been doing in the US Virgin Islands, which I will talk about in a little bit. But it really came about actually from a tour that we did in the Virgin Islands, just as part of a sort of recreational activity, looking at rum tourism in the Caribbean and specifically in St. Croix where we work, or II as it's traditionally known by its Taino name. Crucian Rum Factory prides itself on being one of the longest continually running rum production operations in the Caribbean, over 200 years of rum production on the same estate diamond plantation that used to grow the sugarcane. All the cane is now almost entirely imported into the island, but rum production continues to happen at the rum factory. Of course, it's gone through a number of iterations. But in going through that tour of the rum factory, I was intrigued, as a historian and an archaeologist, as to how they were conveying this message of the history of plantation agriculture, of slavery, and of rum production. And more importantly, I started to become interested in how is it that they actually talk about and discuss this idea of landscapes and ecologies that have been affected by rum production. In digging a little bit deeper, I came across an academic article that more fully discusses the ramifications of production that actually occur not necessarily on land, but in the near shoreline environment and ecologies. In looking more deeply into it, there's been some studies done by the EPA and some other scientists that have looked at algae plumes that proliferate off the southern coast of St. Croix. And these algae plumes develop seasonally and then would spread westward with the current patterns. And it turns out that many of these algae plumes are associated with increased phosphorus from runoff from the rum production, and therefore would lead to massive die-offs based off of lack of oxygen and lack of sunlight coming into those marine environments. The southern coastline of St. Croix has the least taxodiversity amongst fish and coral populations of anywhere else on the island. From there, it started a whole series of conversations in my own mind and amongst my colleagues around what are some of the lasting ramifications of slavery and the plantation systems that we don't necessarily think about, but that continue to perpetuate. And as an archaeologist, I took that question deeper into the earth and began to explore it from a historical ecological perspective. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about this framework of a Black historical ecology. I'll touch a bit on the Estate Little Princess archaeological site where we've been working since 2016, and then talk about a call to action and what it actually means for us as archaeologists and as researchers generally across many different fields and disciplines to sort of step outside of our disciplinary boundaries and think more critically about what we can do and what our responsibilities are based off of the research that we conduct. All right, so this issue of a Black historical ecology, and probably the thing that's been keeping me up at night most of the time, has been how to frame this discussion. Now, this discussion of historical ecology and Black historical ecology really over the last 10, 15 years has centered on this concept and this understanding of the Anthropocene. And again, this idea of the Anthropocene is almost seeing the impact that humans have had as a significant changer or sort of factor in our cultural and our ecological environments, to the point where it argues that there needs to be a new ecological sort of epic that's determined from this. In archaeological terms, we say we're in the Holocene officially, and that is a result of a number of climatic environments. But we're entering into, or some people have argued we've already entered into, the Anthropocene, based off of a number of human agent factors that have been engaged in. Interestingly enough, Catherine Youssef brings up this point in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes Are None, that if we're talking about the large-scale anthropomorphic or anthropocenic changes that have occurred, we are really looking at them in a manner that has been continuing and proliferated over centuries beforehand, amongst Black and Brown communities, specifically in the Atlantic world, as a result of capitalism and the proliferation of racial capitalism. So as we begin to explore this, we needed to ask a series of questions around this. Back in, I want to say this was 2018, myself and my colleague, Dr. Cameron Monroe at UC Santa Cruz, initiated a conference on this discussion of ecologies of slavery, landscape, and environmental change, and featured many different archaeologists. And it was spearheaded and sort of keynoted by Judith Carney, who was mentioned earlier by Brother Michael Twitty, that I think is important to sort of reflect on in terms of the scale and scope of the ecological impacts that slavery has had. Right now, we're at a critical nexus where I think over the last 10 years or so, we've really had an uptick in archaeologists, including Dan Sayers, who's on this panel, who have really highlighted the important work that archaeology can contribute to this discussion of ecologies and their lasting effects, their causes, their development, and their ramifications. From that discussion, we noted a number of key issues, including such as deforestation, sheet erosion, contaminants in soils, all of these different ecological factors that were perpetuated as a result of the enslaved experience. And archaeology has really been able to quantify that in a way that's quantitative as well as qualitative. And we're continuing to make advances in those directions. We could talk a little bit more about why this is significant, in addition to conversations around reparations and what that could mean when we talk about environmental reparations, but also in our understanding of how slavery impacted not just people, societies, and communities, but ecologies as well. All right, so the main issue that I've been having in these conversations and in thinking through this process is trying to situate this idea of a Black historical ecology. And really, I came to the conclusion that part of the issue that I've been having is that the track of historical ecology and the track of Black ecology are really two different intellectual genealogies. And trying to merge them together into one requires us to first understand that they're separate, and then two, to think creatively about what a praxis for a Black historical ecology could look like, and then what the theoretical inclinations after that that come out of that. So thinking critically about historical ecology or Black ecology first, Black ecology is the concept really developed in print first with Nathan Hare's article in 1970 in The Black Scholar. And discussions have since morphed through scholars like J.T. Rohn and Justin Hosby, who have developed a Black ecology section in the African American Intellectual History Society's newsletter, which is really pushing this to new boundaries based off of a number of key concepts. One of which is this idea that ecologies are racialized and operate with inequities and balance and power. Another one is that settler colonial ecologies, they exist as well as their antitheses. So there are ways in which settler colonial ecologies have developed, and the ways in which various communities that have been marginalized are countering those ecologies. There's been a number of interesting conversations around this idea of wilderness and control and tamed versus untamed landscapes and geographies and ecologies, which is really thinking critically about ways that we might need to rethink not just ecologies, but also the epistemologies behind our framing of geography and these ecologies. One particular concept is this idea of the commons and ownership of properties and how that is discussed and entertained. And then finally, there's also a need to redress some of these colonial ecologies. In uncovering the ways in which colonial ecologies and really environmental racism and environmental injustices are proliferated, we need to critically think about how we can sort of disentangle those and dismember those unequal systems. And that's another sort of element that really draws a lot from Black studies in terms of having some implementation into the field. And again, this is a conversation rooted in a Black studies paradigm of praxis, which says the work that we do needs to have actual ramifications and implementations in communities today. Historical ecology, on the other hand, has been developing in the field, and it's really a multidisciplinary perspective that talks about the interactions, relationships between societies and environments throughout time. And in many cases, this historical ecology work can go back over 1,000+ years. In some cases, it tends to focus the last 500 years around the Anthropocene, but it's centered around this discussion of multiple disciplines coming together, including anthropology, geography, ecology, and environmental history, and thinking through the multiple definitions of historical ecology to show the ways in which environments and people have changed, both interacting upon each other as agents of one another. There's tended to be a central focus on the causes and consequences of either major environmental conditions or issues or major societal shifts. So things such as development of capitalism and its implementation in the world and what it has meant on environments. And then finally, this has been rooted in a discussion of environmental history, which I think is important as we think through historical ecology. And again, focusing on environmental history causes us to think about the sequences, the time sequences, which historical ecologists have tended to promote and tended to favor. There's been more conversations now around sort of mundane ecologies. Hauser and Diane Wallman have thought critically about what it means to engage in sort of more theoretical thinking around the mundane and ecological relationships people have. But others have focused on sort of more large-scale, multi-sided epics and shifts in environments and conditions. All right, so drawing these together, I think I might have to tap through these. All right. There we go. Thinking through these together, there's a need to then create some sort of idea of a framework of a Black historical ecology. And for me, I'm developing it right now as a sort of praxis on the one hand, practically implemented as a method. And then on the other hand, thinking of it in more theoretical terms around what it looks like in St. Croix specifically. So as a point of praxis, there's this idea or question of what are the ecological causes and consequences of colonialism, slavery, and their afterlives? How is it that racialized landscapes are developed and have been or continue to be perpetuated? How do we explore how ecologies have been both oppressive and liberatory? So not just one way or another. And then finally, how do we integrate this call for action to address the deleterious ecologies that have developed and perpetuated? I'm going to speed up this conversation a bit. There's a lot of archaeology involved that I'll skip over, but we can get in the Q&A. But this idea of developing a Black historical ecology in St. Croix over the last few years that I've been working there has really come to create a number of insights into the ways in which Black historical ecologies are perpetuated. And so again, I take these 4 questions and enact them in the research that we've been doing in St. Croix. And I will talk a little bit about Estate Little Princess, which is an 18th century Danish plantation on the island of St. Croix, which is one of 3 islands in the former Danish West Indies and in the US Virgin Islands. I engage in this work with my colleagues, Dr. Diana Llewellyn at Riverside, Dr. Elise Odewale at Tulsa, Dr. Alex Jones from Archaeology in the Community, Dr. Bill White at UC Berkeley, and then myself. I was at Vanderbilt when this project initially began. In this entire conversation as well, while the ecology research is sort of the focus of my work, all 5 of us are engaged in different aspects of this question of Black history in St. Croix and at the plantation site. And again, I can talk more about that in the Q&A. We've actually developed this as a multi-year program, and there's no sound in this video, so don't try to turn up your volume. As a multi-year research project that involves training young archaeologists from underrepresented communities, as well as high school and middle school kids from St. Croix into this field of archaeology. And we've been exploring ecology more specifically around the enslaved village quarters, where many enslaved Africans and then later free laborers after slavery ended were living in as they were working these plantations and manufacturing sugar. From there, we're doing a sort of site-wide study of production of rum and cultivation of sugar. And we've uncovered a number of interesting finds, including what you can barely see in this image, bedrock modification. And initially, we thought that the bedrock modification was a sort of colonial addition into these houses to either affix separate posts onto these structures, or perhaps to build separate freestanding structures in between. But upon further research and collaboration with other colleagues, we found that bedrock modification has occurred throughout the Caribbean by Taino and other indigenous communities. And that caused us to reframe our entire conversation then around this idea of how is it that traditional indigenous ecologies were used and repurposed in colonial landscapes and colonial contexts. And from there, we began to ask a number of additional questions around ecology and slavery. All right, our artifacts are still under analysis. We've been working with the Digital Archaeological Archive for Comparative Slavery, but we've been uncovering a number of interesting finds that show that this is truly a cosmopolitan site with ceramics and other material coming from all over the colonial world. And from that, there's also a number of interesting finds we've been exploring logically. One is this idea that the plantation logic and plantation futures perpetuate into the present in some aspects we see from the rum production and the runoff that occurs. This idea that violences to the land are directly tied to violences to the body. And this is actually coming from some of the research we've been doing around coral that's been used as housing in colonial structures. And the fact that there are written accounts of enslaved Africans being tasked with mining coral from the ocean, and some of those free divers actually intentionally blowing out their eardrums to prevent them from having to equalize every time they would go down. So again, these physical violences are attached to body and land. There's also this concept that marine and terrestrial sites are commingled, again, with coral coming from the ocean and being used as construction material on land, having effects on both terrestrial and maritime ecologies. And then this idea that natural sites can also be viewed as cultural sites. And with that, there's history and meaning making imbued. And we see that through the use of tamarind trees as markers of cemeteries and burial sites in the Caribbean and in the Danish West Indies more specifically. And then finally, this concept of historical ecology of marronage, which I'll talk a little bit about and hopefully lead into the next series of talks that we will see here. So just very briefly, just showing some of the work we're going to be doing. A lot of our work was postponed due to COVID, but we'll be going down to St. Croix again this summer, actually in December, and then in the summer we'll be doing more long-term research. But we'll be using uranium series dating, hopefully, to date some of the coral in these structures to more adequately date the construction of these buildings. And we'll also take an analysis of the taxa of coral that are used in these structures so we can compare them to taxa of coral that currently exist off the coast of St. Croix to see if there's major differences or shifts as well as preferences for construction use. And then we will also be looking more fully into questions of deforestation through sediment cores. We'll be looking at the wood taxa that are used from charcoal samples. We'll be looking at seed taxa that exist, and we'll be checking for soil fertility and perhaps evidence of contaminants and heavy metals in the soils as well. This leading off of a lot of work that's been done in other islands, including Antigua by Wells and our colleagues. And more importantly, we're exploring this concept or this Lockean idea of landscapes and ecologies as something that can be commodified and capitalized. And I usually show this image of this map of St. Croix to demonstrate how really sort of organic landscapes were commodified and carved into geometric rectangles that could then be taxed and developed for colonial purposes. The Danes actually had to create their own unit of measure called the Danish acre to tax this landscape. Then we are looking a little more deeply into how these ecologies perpetuate today. And part of it is not just, again, the negative aspects of ecologies, but the ways in which African peoples are, quote unquote, indigenizing themselves to the landscape, to pull from Sylvia Wynter. And in what ways are sort of natural environments being used to resituate and sort of place Black communities, epistemologies, and cosmologies. And we see it, for example, in the Kinda tree, which is in the Maroon community of Accompong, which has a number of cultural significance attached to it. And then we've also started this sort of mapping project where a number of grassroots organizations have actually mapped significant trees on the island. And we're thinking critically about how we can use that as an alternative form of mapping. And speaking of alternative forms of mapping, as we map through ecologies, myself and my colleagues have recently submitted a paper that uses GIS to map the possible locations of maroon landscapes based on a series of social and geographic factors. And more importantly, how those landscapes would have shrunk over time as plantation and colonial structures expand. From there, we ask critical questions around the shrinking size of maroon communities, or perhaps how maroon landscapes actually go across island boundaries. And therefore, maroon ecologies, if we're thinking about it in a historical sense, really transfer from one landscape to another, and they're not bound by these geographic issues or geographic borders. There's also this need then to critically interrogate what does a marine ecology look like in the face of maroonage. And that's something that I've explored in my recent publication on Have Confidence in the Sea and the ways in which knowledges of seafaring may have impacted how maritime maroons escaped from one island to another and made life in a new place. So again, some of the highlights that we have uncovered from our research is evident here. I'll just reiterate these. All right. And then finally, this concept of a call to action. So as we're actively exploring this work, we're also thinking critically about what does it mean to then use this information that we're uncovering to think critically about what it is that we can do as people in the world. And again, this causes us to think beyond our disciplinary boundaries. And so what we've been trying to do is enact a practice of also engaging in ecological restorative work at the same time that we're engaging in archaeological work. So myself and my colleague, Dr. Diane have been working with Diving with a Purpose and the Coral Restoration Foundation and helping them to assist with coral propagation, outplanting coral, and rehabilitating coral reefs in Florida. And hopefully are taking this project now to the Virgin Islands where we can begin to implement this. As more of our students are trained in scuba diving and archaeology, we can begin to implement this as a sort of tandem practice where we spend a couple weeks doing the archaeological work and a couple weeks doing the coral restoration work. And we're hoping that this will, again, lead and encourage others to think critically about how the work that we do can have practical implementation into these wider systems of actually creating some sort of restitution moving forward. And then I just want to leave you all on this last note that myself and Dr. Ayana Llewellyn are critically thinking again about closing the circle of research, repair, and remembering to think critically about what would it mean to develop or create underwater memorials or underwater monuments to the transatlantic slave trade. And because this is GSD and we'll be actually speaking to the design lab at UC San Diego next week, we wanted to think critically about alternative ways and sort of different ways of thinking about what memorialization looks like underwater. Everything from active coral gardens to underwater sculptures. So we'll be describing that in our talk, Spectral Registers from the Black Haddle. And for those of you who don't know, the Haddle is literally the deepest part of the ocean. So we hope to explore that both physically and theoretically and think through what we can actually create and develop in relation to Black ecologies. So again, I thank you all for the time and hopefully we can have a generative conversation in the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you, Justin. And I'm here to tell you a little bit and talk a bit about my work in the Great Dismal Swamp. One way or the other, there's a lot of dimensions to this, and hopefully at least the basic, if not some detailed understanding of some aspects of that work and that, more importantly, the people and history that we've been looking at in my project will come through. So, Matt, slides would be good. Thank you much. So yeah, as the title, long-winded as it is, as is my way, sometimes, like I said, a lot of interesting elements and aspects and politically compelling moments of history here under study in this project. And today I'm going to be particularly talking about African and indigenous diasporic communities in the Great Dismal Swamp, which is in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, particularly Virginia and North Carolina. And so, double slide, but there you go, just to see a quick photo of what I consider to be kind of a classic swamp image, or at least the landscape itself today. So in Trembling Earth, A Cultural History of the Okefenokee Swamp by Megan Kate Nelson, we hear from wealthy Francis Kimball, a description of the Great Dismal Swamp in the late 1830s. Quote, "It looked like some blasted region lying under the enchanter's ban, such as one reads of in old stories. Nothing lived or moved throughout the lonesome solitude, and the sunbeams themselves seemed to sicken and grow pale as they glided like ghosts through the watery woods. Into this wilderness it seems impossible that the hand of human industry or the foot of human wayfaring should ever penetrate. No wholesome growth can take root in its slimy depths. A wild jungle chokes up parts of it with reedy, rattling cover for venomous reptiles. The rest is a succession of black ponds sweltering under black cypress boughs, a place forbid. Kimball had just passed by the Great Dismal Swamp of Virginia, North Carolina, while on a long journey from Philadelphia to family plantations that skirted the Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. Kimball's description of the Dismal could just as easily have come from William Byrd II, who 100 years earlier thought it harbored no living creature, that it had a perpetually present eternal shade that hinders the sunbeams from blessing the ground, and that its very air was foul and corrupted. Some 18 years after Kimball, in 1856, David Strother would write about the Dismal Swamp for Harper's Monthly, suggesting that the sky was obscured with leaden-colored clouds and all nature was silent, monotonous, death-like, and occasional glimpses through the thick undergrowth showed on either side extensive pools of black, slimy water from which rose broad-based cypress trees, and their knees gnarled and knotted like stalagmites in a cave. There is no mistaking a general theme in pre-Civil War Dismal Swamp literature and documents: curious repulsion, fear, and loathing of the morass among white people. And as we will recognize soon, we can add racism, othering, and misapprehension of the very nature of the Dismal Swamp to that list of pre-Civil War themes. In the 100 years or so after the Civil War, the tenor of the Dismal Swamp views gradually changed from that deep repulsion to awe and appreciation of its natural wonders and remoteness, and then to nature conservational. By 1974, the U.S. Department of the Interior had secured a large tract of the Great Dismal Swamp from the Nature Conservancy. At that point, it was placed under the stewardship of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System that has as a general mission the conservation and protection of natural resources and landscapes. Because of the relatively vast size of the acquired swamp tract, in the words of one of the Dismal Swamp Refuge's former managers, it probably represents the first time that a refuge was created for the primary purpose of protecting an ecosystem. While the shift from seeing in the Dismal a foul and forbidding landscape to a beautiful and conservation-worthy ecosystem is intriguing, the fact that these general views highlight its purported natural aspects and qualities is also of some interest. And after all, it would be common sense to think of nature when thinking of the Great Dismal Swamp. But as I have discussed extensively this past 20 years in my work as a historical archaeologist, that seemingly sensible attention paid to the swamp as a natural place represents a not entirely innocent memorial myopia that tends to conceal significant social histories and, while muting testimonies to human praxis, overcoming brutal colonial and enslavement conditions. Crucially, that typical view of the Dismal as a natural landscape also conceals the very human forces and actions that were essential to its continued survival into present-day times. In the form of a question, how do we explain that the 10% of the original swamp still survives to this day? It is not a question that has been asked and answered over the years. And the idea that past peoples who lived within the swamp might have been a major factor in the survival of that swamp landscape till today is not a part of the increasingly enlarging Dismal Swamp conversation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or USFWS, Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, is about 190 square miles in size. Its presence in a large region of cities like Norfolk, Virginia, suburbs, farmland, sprawling road systems, and the Atlantic beach communities of the Outer Banks is nearly counterintuitive. But with countless species of animals, plants, and trees, as well as a certain natural charisma to today's outdoor adventurers and nature appreciators, the refuge is visited by tens of thousands of people annually. Nonetheless, there are few public access points, while the majority of the swamp is off limits to casual and curious visitors and accessible only to hunters during limited seasons per year. Meanwhile, researchers of all stripes must go through the often lengthy permit process to access most parts of the refuge. The limitation of public access is a result of the specific mandates for protection and conservation of natural resources of all national wildlife refuges. But it has also helped detach the swamp from wider public awareness and experience and keep a large cultural and historically profound landscape off limits to most. Though we know very little detail about the significance of the Dismal Swamp to indigenous Americans in the millennia before the colonial establishment of Jamestown in 1607, just down the road, basically, by the way, from the swamp, we can be certain that it was an important element of their regional landscape. 17th century colonial usurpation of indigenous lands and warfare in the Tidewater likely saw an appreciable number of indigenous Americans from Virginia, North Carolina, and beyond move permanently into the Dismal as it lay still beyond the colonial purview. The documentary record testifies to the fact that after 1680 or so, the Great Dismal Swamp became a place of permanent and long-term residence for thousands of African Americans. Around that time, the system of enslavement cemented itself in the mid-Atlantic and Tidewater, which also directly impacted how the swamp was understood, exploited, and used. As was the case wherever people of African descent were enslaved, marinage or marooning, the process of permanent self-extrication from conditions of enslavement and corollary cultural developments consistently and chronically occurred. The seemingly impenetrable Great Dismal Swamp, which at around 2,000 square miles prior to the Civil War was larger than Rhode Island by far, though slightly smaller than Delaware, greatly facilitated marooning or marinage in the mid-Atlantic. As maroons settled the Great Dismal, they formed or found unique communities based on a variety of critical principles, the least of which was continued avoidance of the world outside the swamp and its material culture and people. This was the case until around 1800 in any event. Around 1800, corporations that sought profit from the cedar and cypress trees of the swamp brought in enslaved African-American laborers to construct canals and to get lumber and related wood products out of the swamp and into the world market. From 1800 to 1860, thousands of enslaved laborers lived in company settlements typically located adjacent to canals in the Dismal. Such communities of laborers stayed relatively connected to the world outside the swamp through the constant traffic of boats, people, and commodities along the canals, and through periodic furloughs to nearby towns. The 19th century labor regime of the swamp provided the majority of company workers less constrained work and living conditions than they were accustomed to in the outside world. For example, they worked with very little supervision. They were paid cash or wages for their work. They were occasionally granted leaves to nearby towns, and they had access to illicit canal-centered markets. In fact, period sources indicate that some maroons were part of these canal company communities, working surreptitiously for goods and food. For example, Frederick Law Olmsted, the famed landscape architect, discusses his insights about enslaved company workers and maroons in his 1861 travelogue tome, The Cotton Kingdom. After 1865 or so, the diasporic social and economic world that had dominated the swamp for over 250 years effectively ceased to exist, though lumbering was still a significant aspect of human exploitation of the Dismal. Equally significant, public and widespread memory of this hidden and alternative swamp world and political economy became increasingly fragmented and distanced in the public and scholarly mind in postbellum decades. In the fall of 2001, I initiated the Great Dismal Swamp Landscape Study, GDSLS for short. Sorry, we're a little acronym happy over here in my profession. As a doctoral student in historical archaeology at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, I was drawn more by the possibilities of its diasporic history than by what was known with any certainty at the time. Historians had done an admirable job of developing as much knowledge as possible from a limited, attenuated, and often cryptic documentary record, and in archaeology, little work had been done on the Dismal Swamp's people, and no such work had been performed in extant swampland. In all, historians did not know much from the documents alone, just what a handful of newspapers, some travelogue essays and books, and a lot of creative extrapolation could provide. And even then, the vast amount of documentary sources date to the 1800s, leaving the 1600s and 1700s relatively underrecorded and even unknown. I decided to seek 1607 to 1863 sites and occupations within the current swamp, rather than as pioneer maroon archaeologist Elaine Nichols had done, try to locate them in areas of former swampland that had long been drained and farmed. Armed with ARPA permits and approval of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in September of 2003, I began archaeological survey within the refuge, the Dismal Swamp Refuge. Because no archaeological work to speak of had ever been done there, it had its many challenges beyond the nature of the complex and difficult landscape itself. My work was guided by models of historical community formation, landscape use, and artifact signatures that I developed for the project. The main kinds of diasporic communities I projected were those that formed on the swamp's edges, those that formed in its interior, and those that formed along canals. With the additional work of several American university doctoral and master's students in recent years, in case you didn't catch it, that's where I'm kind of housed right now professionally, American University. The project overall has yielded evidence of several millennia of regular, though not necessarily continuous, internal swamp settlement and exploitation. Beyond initial site surveys, most of our work focused on exploring the archaeology and lives of diasporans who lived along the canals after 1800 or so, as well as those who lived in deeper interior areas between around 1600 to 1860. All along canals, we found strong archaeological evidence for sustained enslaved canal company worker settlements and strong reliance among residents on goods and material produced in the outside world. We also found some evidence of individual ownership or possession of materials, as argued from caches of rare items in canal company settlements. Meanwhile, hold on, let me fast forward here a little bit. So there's one of the bowls we found at particularly that cross canal settlement that anchored on the canal photo I just showed you. And then here's a few more items. So somewhat typical mass-produced type goods from the kind of global market of the time, which is the pre-Civil War 1800s. Meanwhile, at interior sites, which were predominantly maroon and indigenous American settlements, right, kind of a contrast there visually, if nothing else, we recovered evidence of quite limited use of outside world materials, while heavy reliance on swamp available materials, as well as the resuscitation, as I call it, and reuse of anciently deposited stone and ceramic artifacts. Dozens of cabin footprint stains in soil evidence heavy occupation of interior sites between 1600 and 1800. At such sites, we do not see so much direct evidence of individual possession of things, but rather community sensibilities of using materials to the utmost and collectively avoiding the materials and trappings of the outside world. Our field work after 2009 that built off my dissertation findings and analysis tested the idea that with the post-1800 encroachment of the outside world into the swamp, the new possibilities of marooning among canal company workers rather than the interior groups, and the presence of African-American company workers roaming the swamp for lumber, all may have contributed to the detectable transformation in the interior maroon and indigenous American resistance community ethos of swamp subsistence and reliance. Indeed, that work has showed evidence of increases in mass-produced outside world materials after 1800 that may signal the development of interior community trade relations with trusted company workers and relate to decreasing community size in the antebellum era. All right, so here's one of the in-process excavations of one of the 17th to 18th century cabin footprints in the swamp interior, one of the sites. Okay, and here is a little bit more of a 19th century pendant, probably decorative, as in worn on something, bodily adornment of some kind, meanings to be understood a little bit down the road in analysis, meanings of that pendant, implications of it. Okay. In our work, we continue to confirm that important and extremely significant human history unfolded in the Great Dismal, while also working overtime to convey some of our insights to as many sectors of the public as conditions allow. Entirely unrecorded epochs that preceded the modern one are evidenced, as is the diasporic world that emerged within the Dismal after 1600 or so. Archaeological work has provided information on community structuration, day-to-day life, exchange systems, community reproduction, and even some validation of the idea that a substantial population of people inhabited the swamp in perpetuity after 1600 up until the Civil War. We are showing how diasporans formed different kinds of communities that contributed to a complex, varied, and transformational political, economic, and social world that was connected with and subject to outside world forces and processes. As Gramsci and Marx tell us, ideology or ideology can be hegemonic in its capacity to cultivate paradigms that mystify actual social conditions, processes, and relations, past or present. The seemingly obvious facts and truths of ideology become common sense. If the modern world and its modes of production have been characterized by globalized structural inequalities, exploitative labor regimes, racism and racialization, brutalities, patriarchy, and poverties, and if 90% of the people have always lived very different lives than the other 10%, ideologies of common sense emerge that blur, confound, and camouflage those realities and their causes. When we think something is obvious, that a conclusion or surmise is common sense, that is often when a critical doubt should erupt in our minds. Is it not common sense to view, comprehend, and interpret a landscape like the Great Dismal Swamp as primarily a natural one? After all, if people had lived in that swamp, would they not have irrevocably transformed it, as people always seem to do? Beyond that, who would want to live in a swamp, one that William Byrd, Francis Kemble, David Strother, and so many others described in such harrowing terms? Common sense, specifically in America, would suggest to most that the history of the Dismal Swamp is one largely devoid of people and human history. Natural history, sure. Social and political economic history is not so likely. If this was true, archaeological sites and resources should also be absent or limited in the Great Dismal Swamp. And yet some old documents, indigenous, tribal memory and history, and the 9 sites and their thousands of artifacts and features we recovered and recorded all suggest otherwise. For over 2.5 centuries, thousands of people were critical agents in that diasporic world, forming a variety of communities that persisted for generations. And while we can point to an extremely limited documentation of this world as a partial explanation for why public memory has largely forgotten it, or if it ever knew it, why only limited aspects of this history have been remembered, there is more to it. I'm going to have to skip a little bit of this with apologies, given my time constraints left, but we have basically what I wanted to explore in more detail here was some of the ideas presented by biocultural anthropologist Michael Blakey some 30 years ago, right? But this sort of the racialization of places, particularly through the prism of not culture and nature, but as much as nation and nature, right? And if we think of the quotes I read and sort of some of the other information you have from your studies or knowledges, right? This idea of somehow nation and nature being a dichotomous sort of engine across modern history, right? Where people are excluded or included, some are put into the natural category or nature, some are national. We start to see how sort of we can start to begin to critique, right? Why certain memorializations, such as we've been talking a little bit about with the Dismal Swamp and its diasporic communities, right? Some of the condemnable ways, right, that forgetfulness or that even the common sense attitudes people might have about swamps, right, can play into the racism and racialization that persists obviously through today and will till tomorrow. Getting back on some of what I wrote here, those kinds of ideas bid us to contemplate the complex dynamic and dialectical entanglements of racism, colonialism, capitalism, slavery, alternative societies, and social resistance. Obviously, too, landscape and space are essential to such contemplations. We can consider the many ways that racism among Europeans as colonials and then Americans helped create the swamp as such as they define and conceptualized undeveloped places in racialized ways. Then we must understand the ways that swamp dwellers took advantage of the racially defined fear and loathing of the dismal to great advantage, or they took it to great advantage. They would create what I understand is a non-capitalist mode of production in society that lasted for a quarter of a millennium. And clearly outside world white supremacy, paternalism, violence, and forced labor were key factors in the thousands of diasporans choosing to remove to the swamp and form that alternative society. Since the early years of this millennium, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. National Park Service and the GDL and my research program have made some strides trying to bring this some knowledge and understanding of this world back out into public discourse. Okay, we've done, obviously, like I said, some archaeological work. There's a few photos from that. We've been working on some basic stuff in a sense, but fundamental, maybe is the better way to put it. Ways for people to access some information and so on that really are placed well for people to get to them. That's at the refuge, working to develop a display in the what seems to me still the new museum on the mall, the NMAAHC. Okay. And then wrapping up here. All right. So whatever. I have 5 minutes. Yay. All right. This should do then. So in today's alienated, fragmented, and dissonant society, we need evidence and examples of successful alternative approaches to living, social relations, production of daily use things, and community organization. We need models of praxis from which we can work towards our own visions of a more satisfactory and just world. The diasporans of the Great Dismal succeeded in using a culturally distinctive landscape to act upon their critical judgments and ideas about the brutal modern world and their experiences in it. Through this praxis, they did succeed in forming communities that lasted for centuries while remaining largely removed from the outside world and creating a vibrant inside world. They fundamentally redefined their relation to the physical world as well as with fellow humans, forming and contributing to communities that were quite different than most found elsewhere and that they each had been accustomed to. Given the varied reliance among all swamp communities on material deposited in the past by other people, we can also be sure that swamp residents were keenly aware of the contributions past people were making in their lives in the swamp. As a maroon sat chipping away at and modifying an ancient projectile point, they surely reflected on the person who made that tool and brought it into the swamp long before them. We are increasingly becoming informed about the long social history of the Great Dismal Swamp, our memories clearer and historical knowledge more profound as we reflect on what lies beneath the surface of the swamp landscape. The Great Dismal Swamp is a seemingly natural place, but is now becoming a matter of revitalized public memory that real and radical diasporic history unfolded within it, that it is a cultural landscape and part of American and world history. For the first time since perhaps the Civil War, the past people of the Great Dismal Swamp are becoming focal points of public historical awareness. And as I sit here 20 years after my first forays into the swamp, I can say with certainty that the soils of the Great Dismal Swamp run deep, and we've only begun to scratch the surface of what they can tell us. So, and I'll leave you with some thanks and acknowledgement, but that's at least the abbreviated version of the paper I had prepared for today. So I hand it off now to Diane Jones.
Thank you. This has been so inspiring. And I want to say that I'm humbled to be on the panel with two scholars whose work, is very important to me and to anybody looking at maroonage. Matt, if we could start with the slides. This work, what I'm going to present is about maroons in coastal Louisiana, and I started this work really by working on community work, environmental justice, and coastal restoration with citizen scientists and people who call themselves present-day maroons and are directly connected to that population in New Orleans. And so that is really what inspired me to do this. So maroons were self-liberated slaves who chose freedom and communal ways of life that excluded dependency on the economic and social system of the country in which they had been captive. Maroonage was a powerful example of resistance to captivity, as often described in historical accounts. However, in the US, maroons have been characterized by perceptions that downplay their social, cultural, political, and economic impacts. And this idea has been put forth in many of Daniel Sayers' papers, which I've been reading. These perceptions also limit the knowledge and lessons learned from a historical narrative that considers the effect that maroons had on the ecology and environment of the landscape they inhabited, even if for short periods. This narrative can be a resource for today's challenges to coastal resiliency and climate adaptation. Gotta get used to this clicker thing. Okay. Maroons were one with the environment in which they took refuge. They did not go north to seek freedom, but created a free society in an environment that nourished, protected, and made freedom and its surroundings sacred. These landscapes located in the coastal wetlands, like the Great Dismal Swamp, which we just heard about, of North Carolina and Virginia, and the Louisiana Central Wetlands, were places of danger and secrets, two worlds at once, neither fully claimed by land nor water. The Africans and African Americans who came to dwell in these places as a declaration of liberation, self-subsistence, and self-determination chose the natural environment. They turned their backs on the dominant society's material way of life, even the version promised by the North Star, the Mississippi, and the Underground Railroad. If the body had monetary worth, freedom anywhere on American continental soil, north or west, was relative for those of African descent. Enslavement could happen at any moment. Even a Black man free in New York could be shackled and taken south, as was Solomon Northup in 1841. Citizens of the continent either sanctioned or benefited through slavery until the Civil War, where the moral contradiction became unsurmountable. Until that time, the maroon landscape offered an opportunity to live free. Even there, capture and environmental destruction led to the end of the maroon way of life in the swamps, wetlands, and coastal areas of North America. Maroons were not just escaping their enslavement, but the basic idea of European slavery and an organizing principle for living based on the idea that some humans were expandable in the pursuit of possessions for which they could not morally and spiritually bear. Maroons understood the moral corruption of the entire system and took their chances on escape and the possibility of building an alternative way of living in these captive lands. Historians have just begun to explore in depth the existence of Maroons in North America and explode the narrative that all slaves were passive and all runaways went north to join free society. Documentation with this point of view began as recently as 1992 and 1996 with Gwendolyn Medlow Hall and Richard Price's books, which have provided histories of Maroon colonies, and later in 2014 with the publication of books by Sylviane Diouf and Daniel Sayers, which provided evidence that not all Blacks would tolerate enslavement and some practice an alternative way of being. For example, fear of the Maroon way of being also helped crush the Republic of Haiti economically after gaining its independence in 1804. Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, supplied 2/3 of the overseas trade of France, which was the largest individual market for European slave trade in 1789. Free, independent African Haitians were a threat to all of this. Several Maroon communities in the mountains of Saint-Domingue participated in the slave revolt, which began in 1789 under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, and were critical to winning several battles with Europeans. For a short period, the Maroon landscape of coastal Louisiana offered an alternative way of living based on echoing nature and freedom. The Africans newly arrived in Louisiana were mostly put to work to build a new colony, but some ran off to join Native Americans and ran to swamps and wetlands. The wetlands held safety and freedom for many Cimarrones, runaways, or Maroons who inhabited them in the 18th century Louisiana. Bands of Maroons occupied the bayous that led to Lake Borgne from Chef Mentor to the Dupree Plantation. The area was part of what was known as Bas de Fleuve, meaning lower river, Bayou Bienvenue wetlands located southeast of New Orleans in St. Bernard Parish, which lay below New Orleans and between the Mississippi River and Lake Borgne. This site was part of numerous cypress swamps adjacent to the plantations around New Orleans that Maroons occupied in the 1780s and the 1790s and even to the 1800s. Bas de Fleuve was bounded by the plantation grounds or borderlands and composed of inner swamps, hinterlands, The site held various waterways, including bayous, minor rivers, creeks, and ponds. Creeks and ponds that led from the wooded borderlands of the plantations to the dense wooded cypress forests and swamps that offered refuge to maroons. The Lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans, borders this site and stretches from the Mississippi River to the Bayou Bienvenue. The 20 blocks long but 25 blocks wide area is cut off from most of the city by the Industrial Canal. The area between St. Claude Avenue and the river is called Holy Cross. This area includes the historic district. This area adjacent to Bayou Bienvenue is often called by the Lower Ninth Ward residents Back of Town. The 427 area Bayou Bienvenue triangle is directly adjacent to the Lower Ninth Ward, barely separated by Florida Avenue, with travels along the back of town, the New Orleans Sewage and Water Board's East Bank Sewage Treatment Plant, which you can see here, is on the eastern corner of the triangle adjacent to the community. New Orleans Pumping Station, number 5, is on the western corner of the triangle, located in the extreme northwest corner of the 28,000 acre Bayou Bienvenue Central Wetland, which is part of an interconnected system of rivers, bayous, and constructed canals that penetrate New Orleans and the surrounding area. The people of the Lower Ninth Ward have an intimate relationship with the triangle and the adjacent wetlands, for they provide fishing, crabbing, depending on the salinity one day, and danger, hazard the next, based on which storm is in the Gulf. Today, restoration of the Bayou Bienvenue wetland triangle could protect Orleans from storm surge. Bas de Fleuve and the hidden ecology of the Bayou Bienvenue central wetlands offered a social and environmental structure that connected way of living that was key to survival for the residents of the past. The site was home to 2 well-known maroon communities. The first one in 1780 was a borderland community living on the margins of the Bone Plantation. The second one, starting in 1781, consisting of a settlement erected within the Bas de Fleuve. The district ended in 1784 with the hunting of maroons by mulatto free people of color militia and Spanish authorities and the hanging of the maroon leader, Saint Malo. Until that time, Bas de Fleuve and the plants and animals of this ecosystem presented solace and safety. The geographic environment of Lenore Ninth Ward made it possible for slaves to move freely along the waters and within the wetlands, relatively undetected for some time. In addition, the location provided 2 ways of practicing maroonage within the geography of Bas de Fleuve. Borderland communities lived on the edge of the water. This practice was called petit maroonage and was possible in Bayou Bienvenue central wetlands because of the layout of the physical landscape. The French laid out along the rivers and the bayous. So you can see on the map, the Arpent system. The Arpent system allowed maroons at the edge to hide within the wetlands when needed and be close enough to get food and supplies from those enslaved on the border plantations. A map labeled Plan of the City of New Orleans and adjacent plantations, compiled in accordance with an ordinance of the illustrious Ministry and Royal Charter, 24 December 1798, shows the plantation bordering the swamps and makes mention of the Arpents. Thus hinterland maroons live deep within the swamps and wetlands, adapting to the wetland ecology, and the escaped slaves form permanent hinterland settlements. For example, Terre Gilliard, the community led by Saint Malo and his followers, controlled the swamps between New Orleans and the Mississippi River and Lake Borgne, traveling uninhibited along the bayous that connected the lake with the higher ground to the south. The Maroons chose these places because they provided great difficulties for anyone who didn't know how to traverse the swamps, especially slave catchers. The wetlands were full of fish, wildlife, most importantly, remained largely inaccessible to those that didn't know the land. In general, maroonage kept a brutal Maroonage provided a brutal education on self-reliance and self-preservation for African Americans, both for those newly arrived on plantations or for those who had spent years working on them. Life in the swamps and wetlands put their knowledge, ingenuity, creativity, and determination to further test. Although some Maroons continued to raid nearby plantations dependent on the enslaved, they also engaged in trade, production, and new methods for subsistence. The conventional foods, tools, and methods for survival in daily production and activities of the plantation were no longer available in the swamp. Therefore, survival with the natural environment facilitated an understanding of the local flora and fauna. Travelers only entered Terre Gilliard settlement through Lake Bourne, which had a thin branch that led to high ground called Terre aux Boeufs, where Maroons planted corn, rice, squash, sweet potatoes, and other crops. Within Bas de Fleuve, there was a great abundance of forest products for use, including willow reeds from which they made baskets, sifters, other articles. There was also an abundance of wetland fish, shellfish, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and other wildlife. Maroons collected roots, including those from the dwarf palmetto, herbs, including sassafras, berries, and other edible vegetation of the swamp. Indigo vats and crafts were also carved from cypress wood to trade in New Orleans. They also used the cypress wood for housing, but were very selective as the cypress provided cover. Eventually, this was changed and be partly responsible for the demise of their settlements within this landscape. The Maroon method of survival not only depended on the surrounding environment, but mimicked it. In The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, Discoveries of a Secret World by Peter Walpin, the life of a living species that connects and supports others of its kind in ways not easily exposed is explored. Trees nourish each other through a buried and connected root system. Other botanists have researched the underground networks created by mycorrhizal fungi that connect individual plants together and transfer water, carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients and minerals. It appears that nutrient exchange and helping neighbors in times of need is the rule. In a like manner, the trees and plant life of the wetlands and swamps protected and sustained Maroons. More importantly, the Maroons modeled this behavior and supported and connected each other with communal ways of living. They shared what they had, supported and protected each other in times of need. The wetland forest provided shelter, cover, nourishment, and a complex as simple mode for living and building a community that Maroons mimicked. On plantations, the slaves learned how to navigate the space they shared with their masters. Navigating this new marshy landscape may have been physically more challenging. Still, the Maroons' natural inclination included a strong belief in the delicacy of nature and living in moral, spiritual, and physical harmony with it and each other to survive. As Janie Benius argued when she articulated the principles of biomimicry, this way of life is based not on what we can extract from nature, but what we can learn from her. Maroons brought ideas about the power of nature for healing and protection from their native Africa and pursued knowledge of all living things within the swamp environment. In the Bayou Bienvenue Central Wetlands, this includes alligators, snakes, otters, turtles. Maroons also learned from indigenous peoples who also populated the swamps, exchanging knowledge. And in New Orleans, this would have been the Chitimacha. Maroon culture, as other indigenous cultures, offers a model for ecological living that is critical today. The Maroon way of life depended on protecting the cypress forest. Large patches of natural vegetation are the only structures in the landscape that protect aquifers and interconnected stream networks, sustain viable populations of most interior species, provide core habitat, escape cover for most large home range vertebrates, and permit near natural disturbance regimes. In Louisiana, the protection of the cypress forest is critical today for coastal sustainability and resiliency. On August 29th, 2005, the storm surge from Hurricane Katrina traveled up the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, the Mr. Go, through the central wetlands, pushing through the depleted cypress forest of the Bayou Bienvenue wetland triangle, curving down toward the industrial canal, breaching the levee walls and flooding the city. Many believe that the cypress trees in Bayou Bienvenue would have slowed the storm surge long enough to allow the water to lower the water by 2 feet and prevent the levee walls in New Orleans from breaching. Long before Katrina, the cypress forests of Bayou Bienvenue had begun to dissipate due to saltwater intrusion with the construction of Mr. Go. The United States Congress authorized Mr. Go, the Rivers Harbors Act of 1956, with the completion of construction in 1967. The 76-foot-long channel allowed a shorter route for deep draft vessels to travel from the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. Fortunately, Mr. Go was closed in 2007. The closing resulted from years of Mr. Go Must Go Coalition, a group of 17 local, national NGOs and community organizations. The staggering annual wetland loss in Louisiana is caused by human activity as well by natural processes. However, once we see nature as a mentor, our relationship with the living world changes. This insight would improve our ability to adapt and mitigate the impacts of natural processes and how we as humans have chosen to live on and not in harmony with it. From the study of maroon culture, one can learn how to live ecologically with the landscapes we inhabit. As we have seen, maroon living represented an alternative way of being that rested on a deep understanding of the physical landscape, the ecosystem of the wetlands and swamps, which meant freedom and survival. At the same time, the maroons stressed living in communal and restorative manner. Let's see.
Barnacles.
Barnacle.
Now, barnacles, let me tell you about the barnacle deal. See the barnacles on that tree? The reason why the barnacles on that tree is the same reason why the tree is dead. Barnacles is salt water. They live in salt water. So when the salt water came in, it killed the tree. And the barnacles stuck to the tree. Because the barnacles is like a crab or an oyster. It's a crustacean. And it stick to things because they don't move around. And the food comes, they filter small stuff out the water to eat. So you're never supposed to see barnacles on a cypress tree because a cypress tree grows in fresh water. And a barnacle lives in salt water. So this is the evidence that salt water killed that tree because you can see something on it that lives in salt water and it's not supposed to be. You know, see, look at all these stumps. Now, if you look at all these stumps you sticking up, plus 1,000 more of them that's under the water, was live trees in 1965. All this was live trees. Where we standing at, there was trees. Where the sewer treatment plant, there were trees. There wasn't no sewer treatment plant. Where the dump at, you know where we went? All that was swamps. There was no sewer treatment plant at all. You know what I'm saying? So when it...
The life of a maroon was complicated and dependent upon external conditions, both environmental, political, socioeconomic. Survival was dependent on the adaptation to changes occurring in the surrounding landscape. For example, the introduction of lumbering companies, which was earlier spoken about, and the digging of channels led to the destruction of the swamp landscape and the maroon settlements. It didn't matter to those in control that wetlands provided protection from storm surge and the flooding, let alone that they sheltered indigenous people and maroons. In the 1700s, the need to expand agricultural and commercial development was central to the economy and only accelerated the wetland depletion. The political and social cultural evolution that came about in Louisiana impacted the wetlands and the life within it negatively. Maroons were disconnected from the outer material world, only reaching out to reconnect with family or for survival. Present stewards of the land can learn critical lessons from maroon way of life. from the demise of their communities in the swamps of Louisiana and the destruction of wetlands. In fact, recovering maroon culture provides a path of connection to a spiritual, moral, and ecological regenerative way of being. This connection is not difficult in a place surrounded by spirits, history, storytelling, rhythms, and wetlands. Even though Juan Melo's settlements and the maroons of the 17 and 1800s, the Bayou Bienvenue's central wetlands, Bas de Fleuve, have disappeared, remaining and carried forward are their memories, tradition, and raison d'etre. New Orleans today, there are communities of people, young and old, who call themselves Maroons and work to restore culture and the wetlands in the ever-ending battle to sustain freedom. For what is freedom? Freedom is not to live in fear and the ability to make choices. It was fear of capture, forced labor, treatment less than human, and most essentially, the loss of a place for being and self-determination that haunted Maroon communities. Today, communities, especially those like the communities in the Lower Ninth Ward, face many fears, including autocracy, the Anthropocene, flooding, fire, global warming, food scarcity, and the loss of self-determination. If ecological and environmental lessons, including those gleaned from Maroon life, are not learned and new ways to interact with the earth, one another are neglected, there may be no choices, no raison d'etre. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you for really wonderful presentations, so generative, and I'm really excited to get into the space of dialogue with you all. I really appreciated the perhaps coincidental chronology of the presentations, Justin introducing us to the panel by presenting a sort of epistemology of ecological frameworks and offering notions of racialized ecologies for us to consider as we entered the landscapes of the Great Dismal Swamp and Southern Louisiana to learn about Dan and Diane's methods of understanding the histories of these landscapes and their implications. And, you know, the triangulation of the work between the three of you, I think, represents a number of really important challenges to the field of landscape architecture and hints at potential ways to expand the field. And so I want to leverage the interdisciplinarity of the panel and presentations you've put forth in that regard. Your presentations, I think, come together to offer us a really powerful reminder of Black people in the Americas, enslaved, maroon, and free, as, to use Dan's words, critical agents of landscape. That the American landscapes of freedom and of slavery that we've been brought together to discuss all weekend were not only built on the backs of Black people, but on the brains of Black people. That they were not just able to survive in these landscapes, but they were active protagonists in the shaping of landscape. And I think Justin and Diane in their presentations also begin to point to ways in which they still can be. And so among, you know, there've been a number of examples of this throughout the conference, and I'm just thrilled to see that as a kind of reoccurring point of discussion, even with Everett Fly's discussion on landscape-informed architectural decisions, one of many really powerful examples, I think, to offer into the mix of our conversation. So I'll pivot to the actual Q&A by throwing out a question of my own, which is, the conceptual device that Dan Sayers that you reference in your paper from Dr. Michael Blakey in this question of natural versus national, or nature versus nation, that there's a tendency to conflate Indigenous and Black people and their histories with a fundamental category of nature or the natural. And that this is, to quote your paper, the seemingly sensible attention paid to the Great Dismal Swamp as a natural place is not an extremely innocent memorial myopia, but it's sort of acting to conceal the human hands that are and human brains that are essential to the existence of the Great Dismal Swamp. And then in this duality, it's European and Western traditions that are understood as national, or the nation. So I wonder if we could tease this out now that we have all three presentations on the table. Justin, you've referenced the Black Anthropocene, and Diane is, you're talking about not only Maroons living with nature, but emphasizing the knowledge and modifications of them living in this landscape. So I bring that forward to you all to tease out. Thanks so much.
Well, one thing I'll just say is that, for a long time, it was thought that, we just came for labor, which we did. We built half the country, but they brought us here too for knowledge, and particular knowledge. For instance, in Louisiana, a lot of the people came from Senegambia and the Congo, places where they had wetlands and the same kinds of landscape, which was important in Louisiana because they were trying to drain it all so they could expand. But, that's one of the things that, beside the fact that, to say this was just a natural environment, like you were saying, the fact that's really been suppressed is that they knew we had knowledge and intentionally brought us here for that knowledge, because they had no idea how to grow rice and a lot of things.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think, reading Willie Wright, a geographer who's written a bit about this and the relationship between the ways in which wild geographies were sort of mutually constitutive of the concept of wild individuals in the case of Maroon and Maroonage, and how this was perpetuated in some cases by the colonial mentalities of the two being wild. And this idea, again, going back to this Lockean idea that, landscapes have values based off of certain designations, and they need to be tamed and controlled. And landscapes that aren't tamed and controlled are considered sort of wild landscapes, and therefore the people that allow these wild landscapes to perpetuate aren't, worthy of having access to these landscapes because they all need to be used as much as possible. I think this idea, taking it further sort of into the next level, is the ways, if we think critically about the ways in which the natural environment has sort of been tied to individuals. It's particularly when we talk about colonialism and slavery, there's this understanding that people and landscapes have values, or ascribed colonial values at the same time, and their values are directly tied to one another. And I think that this is something that we can begin to explore deeper as we think about abolitions of slavery. And as we talk about how abolishing slavery, or in some cases marronage, leads to this idea that people are socially free in a context, we have to think about what does it mean for landscapes to be sort of free or no longer ascribed this economic value as well. And that's kind of something I'm trying to think through right now, is what happens if we know that these two are entangled together in the way they're commodified. What does it mean to detangle them and uncommodify them together? But that's just one riff off of that idea.
Well, and I would say, with Michael's distinction there, at least that's my primordial moment with that particular conversation. He wouldn't disagree, right, that it's a dialectical entanglement. It's not a binary per se. It's really, they're nation nature. I mean, they're constantly in struggle with one another. That's the contradictory relationship between them, and that contradictory relationship is born of entirely human conditions, right? Either mindsets like ideology or social behavior, action, defiance, resistance, acquiescence, whatever it may be. But right, and it's all wrapped into this fairly messy, complex situation or sort of set of processes. And from that sort of classic Marxian point of view, it's these dialectical relationships or entanglements that are the motors. It's a word I'm not particularly fond of, but whatever, motors of transformation and change and action. Right, in the world, particularly any mode of production, but certainly in the capitalist or capitalistic ones that we're discussing. And so we have to remember, obviously, and just to elaborate, right? I mean, we're talking about the people here, right, across, like thinking of the swamp, but really any of these examples, really any example, they're embodiments and actors and agents in this dialectical process that leads to transformation. And I think you see that clearly in the Dismal. Again, other examples by the truckload, I'm sure, are out there. But like I was trying to impart, got a little abbreviated there, but right, in a sense, the use of the swamp or the settlement of the swamp in these particular ways that I've been trying to explore leads to, right, a particular set of relations between that landscape or that element of it and then the remaining outside world, so-called, at least I so call it, outside world. And it survives the swamp amazingly from, in a sense, I'm amazed in a way, right? It survives all of this. I mean, it's in a sense remote, but it is not in a particularly remote place. Like I tried, Norfolk is the Norfolk city, region, urban area and the suburbs and so on. It's huge and so on and so forth. And all the farmland and so on. I mean, everything was trying to get to it, right? But yet somehow it maintains its sort of bounds, right? The swamp itself. So that's built, all of that's happening here in this dialectical entanglement. And I think there's a richness there if we're interested in engaging this history and having it be relevant today, even if we have to use different language to describe it. But yeah.
Well, I mean, in that view, something else that comes to my mind when I think about the three presentations is the presence and the role of water here as an element that's sort of obscuring, let's say, the kind of visibility and surveillance and static qualities of a landscape that tend to make them more amenable to extraction. And so in view of that, I just wonder, Diane, you even talk about water being used in two ways in Marinage, both as a waterway, as a circulation system, but also a space to live within. And Justin, I know of your work as the ocean as a space of Marinage as well. And so in this kind of framework of Black ecology, what does the presence of water mean here as an ecological condition?
Yeah, I could, I guess, kick it off. I know Mark Hauser has written a lot about water in his latest book on Dominica and the uses of water in very mundane ways is one approach to it. Though some of the work I've been doing in terms of oceans is thinking about, again, this idea of landscapes being commodified and sort of structuring certain social relations in juxtaposition to the fact that the ocean hasn't been able to be commodified in that same way. And in some ways is sort of a geography where these social relations are allowed to shift and morph and change, whether we're talking about people going from free to enslaved across the Middle Passage, or people then going socially from enslaved to free through maritime marinage, and having that ocean be a geography by which that's allowed to occur because it's not controlled to the same degree that these landscapes are, is one other way to look at it. I also think it's, I think one of the things that ties all of our work together is there's a certain phenomenology to the work that we do. I have to give props to Dan every time because I can't imagine doing archaeology in those conditions. And I know Diane living in the bayous and swamps, it's like when you go through and live that experience, it causes you to think about a whole new set of social relations, of questions, of challenges and opportunities that these landscapes make available and perform, and the ways in which you yourself have to modify how you live, work, and operate in these conditions just to make it easier to make life. And so some of the work we're trying to do now is actually scuba diving, trying to think through more critically around what does it mean to conserve sites and what ways do nature and cultural heritage play together, whether it's coral growing on some of these structures or anaerobic environments that allow these ships to preserve underwater. And I think all those different elements can be thought of sort of in unique ways in which, our histories are not just on top of the water, but literally under the water as well.
In the Louisiana wetland there, that central wetland, water is it's like really an awful thing, but it's a wonderful thing too. It's an awful thing because it's led to the depletion of the swamp because of saltwater intrusion. So once the channels were dug, and it killed most of those cypress and the type of wetland that it is, it went from palustrian to estuarian because of all the water, which makes it, it made it difficult for the people living there. And then, of course, all the drainage that happened. And just like with the lumbering in Louisiana, the maroons that lived in there were also, you know, participated in that, because that's how you would make money too. So participating in their own demise by helping to change the wetland. And even to today, water is like that in New Orleans. It's like it's a love-hate relationship. And because, you know, the trees are down, the surge, you know, every day on both sides of the Lower Nine, is the levee gonna, I mean, is the Mississippi gonna come up and top the levee, you know, or is it gonna come from the backside like it did at Katrina? And, but learning too, like really the solution, which they're getting there, but they haven't gotten there yet, that they have to figure out how you live with that, how you do like the maroons and like live in the water. So water is, you know, especially there's kind of a love-hate relationship with water.
Well, yeah, and I
and
think
the other problem I'll say, and I probably want to like contact you later, Daniel, because like I've been going through in a pirogue in a canoe because it's water. I'm like, how do you do? You know, I don't know if I can get in a scuba suit and try to go down in the bike. But it's like, how do you do archaeology in that environment? Because, you know, the alligators and all the water. So I've been going through in a boat, you know, and using my drone and those kind of things. But if you all have any suggestions, I'd like to have them.
Well, you know, compared to the other examples here, or contexts, you know, I mean, the dismal, it's a complex hydrology. The sciencey stuff behind it, I can't get into, much less really claim to know real well. But in sort of typical speak, what I'll say is this: it's fresh water. It's an intermittent swamp, which means the water goes up and down depending on nature's mood, if I may, right, and its seasons and cycles and so on. And what you had, and I think I had to cut that out a little bit in my paper, but you know, at least one of the maps I showed, I mean, out there it's these islands, right? At least that's what I focused on, and it's these areas of pretty good size, sometimes dry ground, that are rising above this fresh water, and that water is very acidic, and it's very legendary in its way for being so, and it's very drinkable. Probably even to this day, but certainly back in the day, before the Civil War and all this millennia before. So, I mean, there is a lot of different meanings here, and the water was, my impression is, certainly pre-1800, before the canals really got, that canal system that I mentioned or discussed a little bit, before that really got into play here, it was reliable. A reliable source of obviously life-giving water. I don't think they sat necessarily with containers catching rain. They had water all around their islands, right? And they could go out and however they had to filter it, if they even did. But in any case, so there's a complex range of potential experience, phenomenological ideas, anyway, existential conditions and so on, and all this that relate to maroons and indigenous peoples and enslaved workers' relationship with that water. I also want to be thinking a bit about, you know, especially from outside points of view, but maybe even some folks that are going in, there's a little bit of sort of an anarchic feel out there in a way, sort of an anarchic water world, because of, and I'm thinking of the canoes here and so on, and I get asked this a lot, couldn't you just row your boat out there and find this stuff, you know, because it was a pain finding those sites, I got to tell you. We didn't have a lot of those maps, and by the way, we didn't have drones, at least not on a grad student's budget anyway back then. In any case, so no, you really had to walk, and that was one of everyone going back. Everyone had to walk around through there until the canals came in anyway, and that was a big part of the sort of safety factor here for when you think maroon or resistance or defiance communities in the interior vis-a-vis outside marauders and slavers and so on who might come in. They had to walk in. They're not canoeing in. They're not taking horses in. You know, they got to walk in. They got to know their way around. And the anarchic part is it's the trees are so thick and the vines and the so on. And from that typical outside point of view, there's a natural, or like I said, kind of there's a mayhem here to the experience. I got to imagine that a lot of them would have felt, even if they were used to swamps, little small things out there in their back 40 or whatever, right there. This is big. It's a big place back then. 2,000, like I said, 2,000 square miles, and they know it kind of. Whatever their might not be to a figure, but they know it's huge. In any case, yeah. So it's going to be a little bit unsettling for people not experiencing it or used to it, and so on. And then, of course, once people get used to it, they can use it to great advantage should they need to. In any case, but then, anyway, back to the general question of how important the water is crucial here. Obviously, from that ecological point of view, the trees, the vines, everything else that were helping to make this a place that was safe, more or less. Water was essential. And then we also have the fact that, and this is documented a little bit, to be honest, but of the water being a particular way of part of the escape, so to speak, right? Again, words always have a little bit of backlash here, but escape is not something I often use, but let's just say it because everyone kind of uses that in general, right? But you can go underwater, they'll read out of the water trick, so to speak. People are using this is even recorded. So it also becomes a means of accessing that life in the swamp that you are you've heard of, you're going out to find it. These communities are out there. Maybe you're one of the sort of first settlers out there, but if you're being pursued by somebody either from a canal a bit later or from the edge of the swamp where you went in, you can use this kind of, because it's a very, very dark water out there, very dark, right? So if you're going under, right, and you're down, and this, by the way, up to 3-4 feet deep in some parts, much deeper where trees have fallen over and there's holes to go into in that peat, right, that's underneath the water. So anyway, the water is hugely essential here, but it's going to be in a not entirely overlapped way with other bodies of water. It's unique. There's some uniqueness to this particular swamp.
We have a question from an audience member. Pauline Gonzalez says, there's evidence of collaboration between indigenous people and maroons in the Caribbean. Have any of you found evidence of this?
Yeah, I guess that's the one working in the Caribbean. It's it's difficult to tease out sort of hard evidence proof of it, but I think there's a lot of assumptions that can be made about overlap. We do know, of course, that Africans who were enslaved and came over to the Americas had their own knowledges of waterways. Kevin Dawson has written a lot about this in his book Undercurrents of Power. And I don't want to put Kat to work. I know she's been dropping book titles in the chat, but he's talked about that a lot. And there must have been some sort of interplay between the communities. There's a problem just generally in the historiography of the Caribbean, where it's generally assumed that Columbus came and then within 10, 15 years, all the indigenous peoples were eradicated from these islands. And it hasn't really been probed more deeply in terms of how that process may have occurred, and also the possibility, which we know through genetic evidence, that there's still a lot of indigenous peoples that exist on these islands in different ways in different contexts. So their knowledges likely would have existed and perpetuated as well. We do know in the case of St. Thomas in 1716, the St. Thomas Privy Council actually required all trees large enough to be made into canoes to be cut down, because enslaved Africans were cutting down trees, building their own canoes, and sailing off the island. And I think that to some degree must have had some sort of indigenous knowledge interplay into it, whether it's just knowledges of which sort of keys and bays to lead out of, or some local knowledges of waterways and patterns. I think when we talk about ecology, it's important to think about ecological knowledges and the ways in which ocean currents flow, the ways in which wind patterns occur, seasonality of those as well, are all important elements of ecology that would have been sort of transmitted between Black and Indigenous communities. And then I'll also throw out there that Cheryl White, doing work in Suriname, has talked a bit about existing maroon communities today have incorporated the indigenous objects in many practices of daily life and ritual. So there's definitely that overlap. And then on St. Croix, with the plantation that we see, we found historic material within some of these indigenous post holes, which leads us to believe that they might have been reusing these bedrock modifications for various other means or structures. So there's, regardless of whether or not there's active evidence of interaction between the two, we know that some of these landscapes were modified by indigenous peoples and therefore were reused or remodified by Africans and Maroons as well.
Does anyone else want to offer any questions?
I can. The question had the Caribbean in, but if there's some leeway here, the dismal, that situation. I mean, first of all, when you think Maroon scholarship across the whole hemisphere, I mean, that's a very common extreme. In fact, you might call it universal almost. Not the contradiction in terms, but close to universal. This idea of one way or another, if collaboration is taken broadly in meaning, that indigenous peoples of obviously a wide variety, depending on where you're looking, but that whole group, right, and peoples of African descent who are marooning, right, coming together in some form or fashion, collaborating. That's common. In fact, like I said, almost universal. But to me, when you look at the Dismal, the specific example, I'd like to go back and point out, right, something that has been one of the hallmark is perhaps more what I'm thinking, but the hallmark, one of the hallmark sort of characters or qualities of the archaeological signature or record, right, that I've seen out in at least the swamp interior sites, and that is the collaboration. Again, I'm going wide here, but the collaboration between ancient, right, long deceased, long past indigenous peoples, right, and the lives and the defiant lives, the resisting lives of Maroons and indigenous Americans who formed these communities after the settling, the colonizing of the mid-Atlantic, but anyway, specifically linchpin on Jamestown there. So, but Jamestown's like 40 miles away, so the impacts of colonialism on the swamp would have happened quite early in the post-settlement period at Jamestown. But in any case, so you have this historical depth to the collaboration, right, in a sense, of Maroons and indigenous peoples, but also the documentary record and so on for the Dismal certainly gives these little glimpses along the way. If you take it with a huge grain of salt, the people writing articles in newspapers and so on are generally going to be white folks at that time. Grain of salt, the identifying of people, but there is a lot of testimony with, again, those grains of salt in mind, of indigenous and Black collaboration coming from the swamp, where the raids on the countryside, the plantations, the farms, and so on. It's groups of indigenous and African American or African descended folks or people. But anyway, I would say, and then when you talk about contemporary with Maroons or that era, that 250 years or so I looked at, there are ways I could interpret it that way. Meaning I could put in a paper, yeah, this artifact or set of them at this site or whatever represents potentially some kind of collaborative or coming together of people of indigenous and African traditions and backgrounds. And so I have done that to an extent. So I think there's a little bit there, but I've never written that I can say it with certainty, because I do want to let everyone know who doesn't know that's out there. Archaeology, right? It's an interesting and unique point of insertion into any conversation. Okay, if you're driven by archaeologically recovered data and information, and you're trained the way most of us are, right, you've got to be able to make your case from the evidence, particularly that sort of part of your evidence set, right, that is coming from the excavations and related to things you do in your practice. So, right, but what we've found is that when you try to work your way out from the archaeological record into some of these areas of identity and cultural attribution and ethnicity attribution and race attribution and gender attribution, right? It's not impossible, but there's a particular way you have to approach it, and a lot of it's, shall I say, long-winded, if nothing else, right? You got to make a long argument, a la the old tradition. It's not a tweet here. You got to make a long argument, right, to confidently make the case and convince others, at least within the profession. So yeah, and in that spirit, I have done a little of that with that particular kind of issue in mind, but I also would just say it's not that it alone, not that it was expected, but that alone has not been the driving research question of mine. In a sense, I've taken it as an assumption, right, that these kinds of comings together of people of these backgrounds and maybe some others, right, are part and parcel of that swamp history.
Diane, what kind of evidence have you come across of this kind of collaboration in Southern Louisiana?
Yeah, so in Louisiana, especially the New Orleans or around New Orleans, in Louisiana, it's we're really lucky because Chitimaca still have a community, and then also the Homa Indians. So there are descendants, and the Chitimaca were the people that lived on where New Orleans was actually placed, right? And so through oral histories from the Chitimaca, and then also African American oral histories, if you talk to people that are Mardi Gras Indians or Black Indians of today, they will trace that back to their relationship with, those tribes. And if you talk to those tribes, they talk about that. And then they also even talk about how, different things, they gave each other things. Like the Chittamacca were well known for weaving and basketry, and some of that was passed on. And then things about food and other things were passed on to the native peoples from the Africans. And then you get the Arcadians that come down. I mean, because in New Orleans, there's great documentation and history of where you get that kind of gumbo mixing culture. And it came from those populations. So there's like pretty direct evidence that happened, and plenty of existing, Indian tribes and African Americans and Cajuns or Arcadians who can give you that oral history of that mixing, because all three of those groups were hunted. Even the Arcadians were chased out of Canada and North America. That's why they came down and lived in the swamp. So all three of those groups were harassed by European settlers. So they had a common reason to band together in that landscape. So there's quite a bit of evidence and people that have written about that. Yeah.
I appreciate you offering that as evidence. I completely forgot there's an entire tradition of Mardi Gras Indians that are devoted to celebrating and thanking Indigenous people around the assistance and wisdom sharing of marinage. Diane, I'd like to follow up by asking you a question that hopefully the other two panelists will be able to offer some insights as well around how you close your paper and presentation with this kind of call to action, which I think there are echoes of in Justin's work, about maroon life as a sort of methodology and a sort of model for crafting more adaptable ways of living in the context of climate change. Could you elaborate further on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky because there actually are people. They actually called me to act. There are people, like I said, that call themselves present day Maroons and groups. And the thing that they're working on. So one is led by Malik Rahim, and then the guy in the video, John Taylor, who considers himself a wetland specialist. Even though John Taylor is not trained, every university, everybody that comes down there that wants to know about wetlands, they go and find him because he grew up there. He was a kid. When he talks about 65, he was a kid in that wetlands when it was, and his family has been there. I mean, he tracks his family back to Maroons. So they, post-Katrina, those people decided, that they had to rethink using the things that he was already doing. I mean, he was already going in that swamp to hunt. He didn't really connect it to, the idea of coastal resiliency until, after Katrina happened. Then these people that were already kind of connected to that realized that, yes, that's you have to, they realized that their way of doing things was an answer to continuing to pump out water, build flood walls, build levees that breach, and so they actually have been, called upon with people in even like the sewage and water people, the levee board people that are doing the other way now, realizing that there has to be another way, have been calling on these people. So I think that there is this call of action to realize there has to be a more ecological and environmental way to deal with the idea of climate change. And it just so happens that there have been people that are connected to that, and there is a history. So I would be like, I didn't make the call. And there are people, that there are people out there doing that. It's just, I just decided, well, this needs to be written about because you guys are doing this, and it is an answer. And it's just another way of framing it, I guess.
Yeah, I would just add, I think part of the thing that intrigues me about this idea of maroon ecologies and geographies is the epistemological angle that's attached to marinage as well. There were individuals who fled strictly for personal means for survival. And then there were individuals who fled and attempted to establish these communities as a counter to these plantation settlements and these capitalist endeavors. And if we think through that as a process that could still continue on because colonialism isn't finished and it's still ongoing, we can think about how do maroon epistemologies continue to exist to perpetuate into the future. And I think that's when we start thinking really critically around this conversation of, restoring ecologies or maybe adapting ecologies in ways that can't encompass commodification or in ways that actively counter it. And, it's been interesting. Some people have said, part of the generative power of these landscapes is that they weren't considered conducive to plantation agriculture. And because of that, it became a space of maroonage. And maybe we need to continue to allow those things to perpetuate because it's in that sort of unused to the colonial project that maroonage has a sort of space to exist, or, the sort of anarchism can exist in this context. And I think that that's something else to consider. And people like Tali Goff have put forth this idea of unmapping these geographies as well, to leave them sort of vague and unknown, because once we quote unquote know them or commodify them, then it opens up a whole new space to be entered into that colonial project. So.
Yeah, and I would just go back to something I said in the beginning of my present paper. But I'm sorry, I won't say it again, but just building on the idea that it's not really readily acknowledged, at least to what I'm privy to in terms of discourses, conversations, etc. Like really thinking about how this swamp, the one I'm looking at, the Great Dismal, it's here because of this amazing world that these agents, actors, resistors created. It's 10% today. All right. I mean, I'm still intrigued. Like I said, how do we even have 10% of this? They really, the outsiders really tried to take this place down. The canals that are still there, you saw them on the map. That was a huge move towards draining this whole thing, turning it to plow, right, and so on. And then there might have been a little incentive to keep the swamp. We need the lumber and so on. Okay, there's all that, but in the heart of it is this amazing world that thousands of indigenous and African people created in that swamp, and they maintained the swamp as such, more or less. So thinking of the question, I mean, all right, how did they, 2,000 square miles, an entire mode of production, an entire economy, an entire way of living, relying quite a bit on ancient people's, the work of their labor and their creative insight and mind and how to manipulate the world to make something useful or something that had importance in their lives 3,000, 10,000 years ago, anywhere in between. People of 1700, 1650, 1800 living in part, not entirely, on the things people left in the ground in those very same spots, right? They're pulling them right from the soils of those islands that I'm working on, right? There's something there that matters today. Can I tell you, the royal you, what that is? No, not with entire certainty, but I can say it probably has something to do with what Marx and many others have said since. Somehow the things we make and use, and quite often they are divorced, right, or kept apart, right? Things are made for us by others. We use them, we consume them, right? That's a huge fundamental process of capitalism and the capitalistic types of ways of living, right? But now you're coming back to this, at least in the swamp example, people making things themselves, not necessarily judging on how skilled they are. Can I sell it at Walmart? It has to look this way. No, is it useful? I'm not the most handy person with stone, but I can make something to cut this thing I need, out of this ancient tool. Thank you, ancient person, for the tool. Now I'm going to make something and use it as much as I can, and so on, right? There's something there. There's a message, right, that's being conveyed. But in addition to the material culture, which, that's what we archaeologists focus on a bit. Then you have the fact of the persistence of the place and the fact that for a long time it was 2,000 square miles in size. Like I said, the size of really at least our smaller states, more or less, in the earlier colonies. In any case, right, they did it. So how can we do it? What are the connections between development processes, right, just in the economic sense, right? Uneven geographic development, right? A big conversation going on in geography, especially among political economy-minded thinkers like David Harvey and Neil Smith and others, right? How can we come to understand the creation of these remote places, these places that are less developed, versus, say, one of the sort of iconic sort of ways of developing landscapes, the urban areas, the suburban areas, right? Extractivist zones like mining districts and so on, farming, right? Thousands of acres taken over to plant a ton of stuff for other people to eat, other than the farming workers, enslaved workers, and families that own and people that own. How does all this come together, and how does a place like the Dismal or the swamps and mountains of marooning and other modes of resistance, how do these play, and how are those places there to begin with, for then the process of the communities that resist, that go into them, right, to perpetuate those places? But they had to be there to begin with, right? And so the Dismal Swamp was there in 1607, not surprisingly, but it was there. They were able to go and then and effectively maintain it, right, in the face of really long odds, right? Capitalists, even in the early days, found their ways, right, to change this stuff over. The countryside, even at the time, showed it, right? Given the right conditions, the woods are gone. We're plowing this up. We're putting towns and villages. We're going to take over every pathway anyone ever walked, every animal walked. We're going to turn it into a road, and then our carts are going to go down it carrying goods and so on. Blah blah blah. Anyway, I think so. With the swamp, in the nutshell, it's back to that thing I kind of mentioned. But not only do we have to thank, so to speak, the people who thrived out there for 6-7 generations before the Civil War, but that it's still here. We have to consider them when we think of conservation and ecology and so on of the swamp and the region, right? They're front and center of the reason why this particular landscape is there. But then, of course, I think you extrapolate a little bit and say other landscapes probably have a similar history.
This is great. Thank you to our panelists for a really wide-ranging and fruitful conversation. And I really just, Dan, don't apologize for your focus on material culture. It's what makes having this conference at a design school so energizing, because you all, we're learning from you all in terms of your methodologies, and we're left to really consider expanding the way that we work. And, Diane and I now, have lots to kind of chew on in terms of integration and application into our field. I think I've always had a lot of contentions with ecological frameworks as they exist in our discipline. And so the introduction of the kinds of epistemologies and also the specificities that come out of your research methodologies as archaeologists is really valuable and is going to, move us forward, I think, as a design discourse. So with that, I will transition it over to Rafaela for some closing remarks. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sara.
Hello again. We have come to the conclusion of our conference, and if I could have my image, thank you. The word apology, from the Latin apologia, was used in the early modern period to signify a defense. That is, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the action of making an emotional or earnest appeal to someone as a result of a charge or imputation, or, more informally, the word meant a justification or explanation. Given that the contemporary meaning of apology is as an admission of error accompanied by regret, I thought I should explain why I'm using this word as the title of my conclusion, and why both the old and present meaning of apology are useful for my purposes. In his keynote address on Friday evening, Michael Tweedy proposed that the way in which slavery is discussed in some contexts as an institution whose very memory poses a threat to democracy and to the very ideals the founding fathers held dear should be revised, or at the very least it should be revisited. This is not an easy task, because the founding fathers and documents like the Declaration of Independence amount to what sociologists have described as the American civil religion, often invoked in times of national crisis. We hold these truths to be self-evident, begins the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain sorry, I cannot read this word, with certain rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are very powerful words indeed, especially because they remind us that every citizen has the same rights under the law, no matter the color of their skin, their religion, their sexual orientation, and so on. And if one considers that Thomas Jefferson's original wording for this paragraph read, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable rather than only self-evident," we can see why they amount to a secular religion that is very much needed in today's society. Historian Jack Rakove has noted, however, that when the words were originally written, the equality referred to in the Declaration was not that of single individuals. It was that of the American colonists seen as a people, who claimed the same rights to self-government as those of other nations. It was only after the American Revolution that the meaning of equality began to expand and to take on the meaning it has today. Jefferson was aware that the new republic had not extended the same rights to every man and woman, particularly those in bondage. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, I quote, "God, who gave us life, gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed the conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Commerce between master and slave is despotism," end quote. Jefferson biographers have been at pains to reconcile these words, which are inscribed on his monument at the National Mall, with the reality that he was a slave owner. One of the most common explanations is that he was a complex man, full of contradictions, but this logic misses the forest for the trees. As the late Irish historian Conor Cruise O'Connor pointed out, Jefferson was well aware not only of the moral evil of slavery, but also of the latter's effect on white society. In the notes on the state of Virginia, in fact, we read, I quote, "There must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on the one part, and degrading submissions on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it, for man is an imitative animal. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose to his worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny, cannot but be stamped by it with odious peculiarities. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances," end quote. For this reason, Jefferson envisioned an end to slavery that involved returning the enslaved to Africa. Only there they would be free. Because they had experienced tyranny and oppression, they would not be able to forgive or forget, and therefore coexist peacefully with their former captors. And by extension, they would not be able to govern without replicating the same tyranny. Africans and their descendants, being property, had no citizenship rights, and therefore no right to life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness. But how could this logic be reinforced when the property indeed consisted of people? Colonial legislatures provided the answer to this question. Since 1660, new laws written throughout America had conceived increasingly harsh sentences for the enslaved to reassure landowners that their black labor could be controlled. Jamaica, Barbados, and mainland American colonies began to codify racial difference in law by making racial intermixture illegal and protecting slave owners' right to brutalize their captives, including the right to dispose of their lives. By the time the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1776, the concept of difference, specifically racial difference, had been baked into the law for so long that it compensated for the presence of a majority white overseeing caste. It is regretful, and here is how I invoke the present meaning of apology, that difference was used to rank human beings into classes, which led some to hold that blacks are genetically inferior, a claim white supremacists make to this day. Speaking about equality, while at the same time loathing difference, does not make a society just for all. It makes it racist, because it implies that those who are different are not created equal. This kind of thinking replicates tribalism. Of all the professions, landscape architecture is perhaps the best equipped to turn the concept of difference on its head. So let me now get to the explanatory meaning of the term apology I chose for my conclusion. In the afterword to his Black Landscapes Matter volume, Walter Hood asks, I quote, "Is it possible within the marginalized and excluded to see a means for true difference and diversity within the United States?" End quote. Not only the answer is yes, it is possible, but that possibility can be made to begin within landscape architects themselves. Here's why. Landscape architecture's interface engages a broad section of society. Also, landscape architects know that with difference comes resilience, which is so important as we face the dire consequences of climate change. Through experience, we've learned that cultivating manicured lawns instead of wildflower meadows, planting monocultures instead of a variety of crops, enforcing sameness by means of pesticides and herbicides, all these practices cause species extinction and are leading the planet on a dangerous course, as many have observed. In ancient Greece, farmers were the most respected members of society because they were tasked with the defense of their cities in case of foreign invasion, given that their farms surrounded the urban environment. Similarly, the Roman general Cincinnatus was said to have been plowing his fields when he was called to resume military duties. Landscape architects are not farmers, and today's threats do not necessarily come in the form of actual invasions. Nevertheless, the threats to the well-being of society as a whole are many and come from various fronts. Because of their skills and their knowledge, landscape architects are uniquely positioned to promote difference, and including human beings within the species we pay attention to in our landscapes today is what makes us worthier. The best example comes from the founding father of our profession, Frederick Law Olmsted, who made 2 trips to the south in the 1850s, less than 100 years since Notes on the State of Virginia was published. Olmsted observed the materialization of what Jefferson had suspected, that is, that slavery had impaired his fellow Southerners' ability to distinguish right from wrong. But unlike Jefferson, he thought that the peaceful coexistence of whites and blacks was possible, but only after Southern planters had been shown that their true economic and social self-interest lay in the elimination of slavery. Olmsted was told on a couple of occasions the poor Irish workers were employed in place of enslaved people to carry out the most dangerous jobs because the latter, that is, the enslaved, were too expensive a commodity. So the Irish, despite being free, were dispensable. Profit was the driver of slavery. Difference based on race was an excuse. Olmsted's concern for the betterment of the lower classes and the universal right for access to public parks within congested urban environments was indebted, in part, to his travels to England, where it witnessed the harsh conditions endured by English rural laborers, facilitated by an uncaring and homogeneous class of landowners, but it was also indebted to his travels to the south. Today, it is just as crucial to pay attention to the world around us. And even if we don't do so for moral reasons, all we need to consider is that neglecting difference amongst ourselves puts us too along a path toward our own extinction. The question I put forward is then how best to train the new generation of practitioners so that they may be able to take up these challenges, and whether judging the merits of every landscape department in the country and the success of every landscape architect according to a single undifferentiated standard is still the best course of action. As I conclude now, I'd like to turn to a comment from the audience. At the end of my introduction yesterday, someone wrote, I quote, "It's rough. Now imagine leaving it," end quote. To this comment, I'd like to reply that we don't have to limit ourselves to travel back in time to imagine slavery, because slavery is alive and well in our contemporary world. Even if it is, of course, illegal everywhere, slavery still exists underground, and in some places it's just more difficult to measure than in others. There are close to 30 million people subjected to slavery today. It is double the number of the captives that were taken from West Africa in the 350 years of the slave trade. One reason is worldwide population increase that has affected mostly the developing world, where extreme poverty is more widespread, and where climate change and natural disasters have made increasing numbers more vulnerable. But population increase and poverty alone are not a direct cause of slavery, even though when there is a failure in the rule of law, for example, when there is corruption, the most vulnerable are those who suffer the most because they are at greater risk of being enslaved. What's particularly interesting is the connection again between slavery and landscape. Could I have my last image? Thank you. For the sake of protecting the planet from the adverse effects of climate change, large-scale international agreements between various governments have been put in place to protect forested lands and natural resources. The problem is that these treaties and agreements that exist to protect places like the Amazonian basin in Brazil, for example, or the Sundarbans mangrove forest at the bottom of India and Bangladesh, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, these treaties and agreements are not enforced, even if they are meant to protect these places. Natural reserves, where lucrative resources are particularly subject to exploitation. In places like the Virunga Park of Congo, which you see in the image on the left, I believe, which contains the native habitat of gorillas and that it's at risk of being lost, in such place, when the legal timber cutters left, an opportunity open for criminal slaveholding activity to fill the gap and to fill the market demand for timber, particularly exotic woods. Also, in Eastern Congo, there is no gas supply or electricity, and almost all the cooking is done by means of charcoal, which again comes from the trees in the Virunga Park. Maps of these areas have been drawn with the aid of satellite images, and it is clear that as pressure is being put on the natural world, this is accompanied by slavery and violence. Professor Kevin Bales, who studies contemporary slavery, has pointed out that deforestation is only one part of the problem. There is also a serious pollutant effect that comes with this phenomenon. For example, in the upper part of South Asia, children and entire families are enslaved to work in brick kilns most of the year. These chimneys are often built illegally on public lands, and they burn things like old tires and used motor oil, which of course contribute to carbon emission. We talked these past 2 days about the destructive effects of slavery on the American environment, but also today's enslavement brings with it a huge environmental threat. And because we are concerned about climate change, we should remember that slavery is still part of the cause. I think this offers an opportunity for expanding our horizons, as have the papers presented at this forum and the enlightening discussions that have taken place. I hope that the affinities that have emerged these past 2 days between our different disciplines will be explored further in the study of the American landscape. Now, I would like to thank our speakers for sharing their amazing scholarship, our guest, Michael Tweedy, for an insightful and inspiring keynote on Friday, and our moderators. Thanks are due also to the Landscape Architecture Department and the Graduate School of Design and the staff for supporting this conference, and to the audience finally for attending. Thank you.